So yeah, as Sherry said, I'm the Director of Rec Programs at AIARE. And so that means in my position, I work with subject matter experts to create avalanche education programs. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how we learn, and specifically about how we learn about traveling in the backcountry. So today, I want to give you all a tool that will help you intentionally direct how you learn in the backcountry. So I'd like to start off by getting a feel for who's in the room. So stand up if you travel regularly in the backcountry. Great. Awesome. So remain standing if you've been doing that for more than 5 years. Remain standing if you've been doing that for more than 10 years. How about 15? 20? 25? I was sort of wondering how far I would go out. 30. Now I feel like I'm calling people out. 40? Great. Thank you very much. So as you can see, we have a depth and breadth of time spent in the backcountry here in this room. And does that equate to experience? So you could describe experience as the culmination of lessons learned over time. And so building experience would simply be a matter of having enough time to learn those lessons. And this intuitively makes sense. As humans, we are hardwired to learn from our experiences. We look for connections between a cause and its effect. We are a sense-making and pattern-recognizing animal. We seek to make order from chaos. It's a distinguishing feature of our species and a feature of our large brains. So that ability to recognize patterns and create order to make sense of the world is why we can figure out equations that create this beautiful picture. But it's also at the same time why we can see Jesus in our toast. Sometimes we see patterns that aren't actually there, and we create order from incorrect connections. So as people who move in a winter backcountry environment, this tendency to see Jesus in our toast, to make connections that aren't really there, should greatly concern us. We move in a potentially very consequential environment, and making connections that don't actually exist, or even worse, making incorrect connections between two phenomena can potentially be fatal. So to put a finer point on the quality of our learning experiences, I like to distinguish between experience and expertise. So you can have a lot of experience doing something, but if you started making incorrect connections early on and you don't get feedback to correct it, you can continue to reinforce those incorrect connections. You can have a lot of experience, but in effect, no expertise. You're still doing the same things you did as a novice, just for a longer amount of time. So how many of you in here could say that every time you travel in the backcountry, you learn something new or greatly add to your body of knowledge? Are you consciously driving your learning, or are you passively receiving what comes to you, going along with it each time you go out? So if experience is an accumulation of lessons, expertise might be described as an accumulation of the right lessons. So you may have heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is those who are the least knowledgeable about something are often the ones who have the greatest confidence in their knowledge or abilities, as represented by this peak here. As travelers in an environment that can potentially kill us, we want to make sure we spend as little time around this peak as possible. So we want both our education and our experience to drive us out to this area, where we know enough to know what we don't know, and we have the humility to acknowledge it. And this, I believe, is the hallmark of expertise. So as an educator, when I look at this task of building expertise, I immediately think of the teaching tools that I have available to do this and the feedback-rich environment I can create in order to facilitate it. But when I look at educating adults about winter backcountry travel, there are two major issues with my classroom approach. And the first is that while I can still employ similar teaching tools, many techniques are reliant on regular and repeated engagements with my students. So in Avalanche education, there are fewer student-teacher engagement opportunities, especially as Avalanche education is often treated as one class and done. The second issue is that the winter backcountry environment can be a very feedback-poor environment. Again, if we use involvement with avalanches as our primary metric of a successful backcountry trip, most of the time we're not going to get any feedback at all. So a version of this photo is probably a familiar image. It reinforces the danger of the social proof heuristic, that what worked for one group could surely work for our group. I'd like to put a slightly different spin on this photo. Let's presume all the tracks came from the same group, and the fifth person on this slope triggered the avalanche. But what if there were only 2 people in your group? The avalanche triggered by the fifth person wouldn't be here. And how many times do you think that you could have easily triggered an avalanche, but just by a roll of the dice, you didn't that day? Did you get any feedback on your actions that day, other than to reinforce that you were doing something right? So a cognitive psychologist named Robin Hogarth has dubbed these feedback-poor environments wicked learning environments. And he spent much of his career examining decision-making and the development of intuition. And he's proposed this schematic to describe different types of learning environments. So the quality of feedback from an event is represented on the horizontal axis, while the consequence of making an error is represented on the vertical axis. So on the left side of the schematic, feedback is relevant. So accurate learning is easier. Think of how a canoe moves when you shift your weight in it. Clear cause and effect. The learning increases in precision as you move from more lenient to more exacting consequences. So again, thinking about that canoe and what happens if you get in and you immediately capsize it. The feedback is very clear, and you know exactly which body movement caused you to capsize. So Hogarth dubs this realm a kind learning environment. There we go. The trickier learning environment is over here. On the right side, what Hogarth dubs a wicked learning environment. And this is where feedback is inconsistent or there's a randomness in the outcomes observed. For example, dealing with the probability of triggering an avalanche. We could travel an avalanche terrain over and over again, over the same trigger, even in similar conditions, but because of the spatial variability of the snowpack, it's inconsistent when we actually trigger an avalanche. The consequence of doing the wrong thing is actually quite lenient, so we don't even realize we're making an error. And this can lead to building unfounded confidence in our actions being taken. When the consequence is exacting, for example, actually being involved in avalanche, the inconsistent nature of the feedback might make us attribute the wrong action to the outcome. Was it a misunderstanding of terrain or a low understanding of the actual conditions? So in this photo, skiers 1 through 4's experience put them in this quadrant. But skier number 5 was up here. And again, I put the question, if skier 5 hadn't triggered the avalanche, would skiers 1 through 4 feel they got any feedback from this outing? This is a hallmark of a wicked learning environment. If avalanches are our only feedback, then how on earth can we learn? So I propose we emulate experienced teachers to actively create feedback-rich environments in their classrooms. So I have a task for you. Take a second, if you have a pen or on your phone, jot down what your preparation for going into the backcountry looks like. What do you do each morning before you go out? The teacher in me is going to make you write this down. So there are probably lots of details and variants on this, but overall, it hopefully looks something like this. You check NWAC. You make a plan about where to go based on the hazard and the conditions, where you think the skiing or the riding or the climbing is going to be good that day. You go do it, and then you come back home. So in this planning process, no matter what level of detail you go into, it all starts with a prediction that the snow will be a certain way, that the weather will be a certain way, the route will look a certain way. And its most basic level, we are implicitly making a prediction about what we expect. So borrowing a teaching tool to create a more feedback-rich environment, I propose we make this prediction process explicit. If you make a prediction, then there will be an actual event to compare it to at the end of the day. And this comparison is a form of feedback that we get every time we travel. So at the beginning of the day, when you check NWAC, name what you expect in the form of snow conditions, weather, describe all the hazards you expect to encounter and your plan to avoid them, describe where you will go and what the terrain will look like, and then write all this down. In addition to making an explicit prediction, this act of planning also primes your brain to notice the information related to your predictions. And so I want to link to Evelyn's great slide with Mike Cullen's graphic in there with all that information that you're swimming around in. This prediction helps prime you to notice what's important. Because we're bombarded with an overwhelming amount of stimuli to our five senses at all time. And so that we're not paralyzed by this, our brain has a very effective filter to ensure that only the information that's most relevant gets in. So by explicitly making these predictions, we're priming our brain to notice what confirms and denies these predictions, in effect, to let that information in. So instead of just making observations about snow conditions and looking for red flag signs of instability, we're looking to confirm or deny the hazards we're expecting. Then at the end of the day, synthesize all these observations into a picture of what actually happened, and then compare it to what it was expected. Did you get it right, or were you off? So here's an example. Predict there's going to be good corn skiing. How many people does this happen to? Turns out conditions were really dependent, and it was not good corn skiing. So it's an example of when our predictions were off. It's good to just note these things. Here's an example when we got things right, what I hope happens a lot in the next month or so. So this process of prediction and observation is probably something you already do, and it's something that you probably do without even noticing. So the shift that I'm proposing is taking this teacher's approach to make that implicit process explicit, to notice what worked and didn't. And each of these is a piece of feedback. In short, debrief each of your days, but do it with a structure of comparison instead of just talking about what happened that day. So when we do this, by comparing what happened to what we expected, we begin to build knowledge directionally and cumulatively. And the connections we make prime us to observe more phenomena and make more connections, which leads to even more connections. So we begin to build a lens that notices the interactions among weather, snowpack, and terrain. And this will help us develop an understanding of what's going on around us at a finer and finer level. So instead of just randomly acquiring expertise and hoping something sticks, we can target a new piece of information or try a new route next time. In short, we target acquiring expertise. So by creating structures for greater feedback, we begin to move from a feedback poor to a feedback rich environment. The other teaching tool we can borrow from is self-reflection on learning. And for any of you who know or have a middle school-aged kiddo, you may have heard them precociously toss around the word metacognition, which is simply consciously thinking about your thinking. And the reason your middle schooler knows this word, aside from they're precocious, is because it's a very effective critical thinking tool that enables you to apply what you learn in school to life outside of school. So as a backcountry traveler, this should be especially intriguing because the backcountry environment is highly dynamic and complex. So for example, if you only take one Avalanche course and you took it in the spring, how confident are you that you can apply the knowledge that you have acquired to a trip in early December? So metacognition is an especially important tool for driving self-directed learning. And again, presuming you only take one Avalanche course, you're on your own to continue your Avalanche education beyond that. So the problem is that when we're novices, we're swimming in a world of too much and seemingly random information. Really want to build on Dallas's dots. So we actually have more information than we can handle. So you need a method to direct that learning rather than randomly hoping to connect dots. You're intentionally building upon your base of knowledge. Fortunately, the predict, observe, compare model that we use to create a richer feedback environment also fits well into the metacognition cycle. The key is being deliberate about what we do at the compare step, and how we ensure that information feeds back into our predict step the next time we go out. There we go. So when we compare, it's less important, at least initially, whether or not the observations matched our predictions. The key is that we actually identify if they did or did not match. And then more importantly, we try to identify why our prediction was correct or incorrect. Then we will name what we'll do differently next time because of this information. So I like this to remember this by the phrase, what and so what. So let's look at our comparison and prediction, or comparison of our prediction and observation about corn skiing. So comparing these two events, the cause can come from many possible reasons. Maybe it was sunnier than we expected because we misunderstood the forecast, or the actual weather events were different than an expert's forecast. Or maybe we're new to this region and we didn't anticipate how strong the solar influence can be this time of year. Or we just missed the nuance in the timing of spring skiing. These reasons are all the what. So the next part, the so what, comes in naming what it all means. So next time we will start earlier, or so next time we won't underestimate how strong the sun can be in March, and we'll stick to more due northern aspects. I think it's easier to identify when our predictions didn't line up. It can be harder and more challenging to notice when our predictions do line up. And it's especially hard to identify why they did. And so this instance of nailing it on a powder day should at least beg the question, were we good or were we just lucky? The so what is trying to figure out what we did to nail it. And this is where especially rich learning opportunities lie. You aren't adding to your list one more, to your experience list one more thing not to do next time. You have the opportunity to identify what you should do again to yield the same results. Did we go somewhere familiar, or did we make a plan to designate what terrain we were closing ahead of time, which enabled us to focus on farming our lower angle stash? Or did we just do what we've always done before and we're not really sure why it worked, except that it's always been good when it dumps a bunch of snow? So it's tricky. And I end on this example to note that travel in the backcountry still holds a lot of uncertainty, no matter how many processes you put in place to reduce it. But what I do hope is that by turning a more directed light on what we do, we can catch those times when we are unconsciously following habits before they lull us into a complacent sense of getting it right, when we are actually just getting lucky. This process of predict, observe, compare shouldn't look completely new. For any of you who have taken an AIARE course, this is the backbone of the AIARE curriculum. For those of you that work in any form of risk management, it aligns with ISO 31000, which is the international standard for risk management. It's so universal, it even showed up in my daughter's preschool curriculum. Because this is a process anyone can do. The winter backcountry environment is a wicked learning environment, and we have the added tricky layer of also having to largely self-direct our learning. So I hope no matter the flavor of this process that you use, you find a way to incorporate this into your backcountry travel, to move from being a long-time backcountry traveler with a lot of experience to a long-time backcountry traveler with a lot of expertise and humility. Thanks. Do I have time?
Awesome. Thank you, Liz. We have time for probably a question, maybe two. Anybody with their hands up? Perfect. All right. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
Wait. We have a question.
We got a question.
Just kidding. Yeah, go for it. Sorry.
So that was an awesome talk. Any chance you can make those slides available? Because that's a lot to take in and observe.
It is. Don't you talk about metacognition every day?
Yeah.
I believe this talk is available.
Yeah, so all the
afterwards.
videos will be up on YouTube, probably Monday or Tuesday this week. It's up to you if you want me to share it somewhere.
Yeah, and I will. I have a to-do for myself to write a blog post or article, and then find an outlet for it.
That would be awesome.
But I will do that, so I'll add that to my to-do list. Thanks.
Cool. And I think one more question, and then we're good.
Fantastic talk, thanks Liz. Hey, I just had a question about applying the predict, observe, compare in this wicked learning environment where our opportunity to compare negative outcomes is so seldom. So if we go back to your example of the 4 skiers and the 1, had it just been the group of 4, the prediction would have been no avalanche and they would have observed no avalanche, and they would have compared no avalanche. And I think one of the challenges we have in the avalanche world is that despite hearing, obviously, fatalities every year that are tragic, the number is actually very low. It's a very rare event. So I'd welcome any suggestions around how you actively engage in the opportunity to experience negative events in a safe way from lessons, and maybe somebody else might want to chip in on that too. But just some ideas about how we could use that framework for those negative feedbacks in that wicked learning environment.
And that's the thing about spending so much time working on this talk is that, you know, you think like, God, there's a whole other like several hour talk to think about like this actual piece of like when we do things and we still don't get feedback. And I think that this goes to Lynn's point about margins and why it's so important to just get into that habit of consciously examining what you did that day so that you can recognize, like, did we have margins? Did we actually stick to our plan? Did we have a plan that accounted for the conditions? And then I think, and it's in the area, the debriefing, you know, questions there. Did we get this right or did we just get lucky? And I think that that's like kind of each day when I have a small child, so my days getting out are few. And when they go really well, like it's hard to still force yourself to think like, did we actually pull that off or did we just get lucky? And so I think probably that like the part 2 to this talk would be talking about all that, like, did we get lucky? And I know that's the title. I'm looking to Lynn as the encyclopedia of all those articles, but I know that's the title of many articles, including an issue of TAR either last year or the year before. So, but thank you for bringing that up.
Awesome. Well, thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.